Okay. Hi, welcome to King's College London, Department of War Studies. My name is Jack MacDonald. I'm a senior lecturer in War Studies here in the department. I'm also the director of the Centre for Science and Security Studies, which has a long history of work with open source intelligence. And I think looking around the room, I see many of our ex-colleagues who've gone on to work in open source intelligence all around here. But this evening, we're here to be hearing about a new book, Open Source Investigations in the Age of Google, which examines different open source research for strengthening human security. And one of the things about our department, we are the Department of War Studies, but we do have lots of people who are interested in peace. And human security is one of the things that we do in this department quite well. We have many people who come from critical approaches to it. So we also have a long-standing tradition of work in open source intelligence and open source investigations. CSSS does open source intelligence and open source investigations in a wide variety of subjects, notably non-proliferation and international security. We also, Matt Moran, who is our head of department, alongside Chris Hobbs and Dan Down Salisbury, has also authored a major co-edited volume on open source intelligence. So it's great to see yet another book coming out with a great selection of authors to kind of continue that tradition. For those who are interested, we also have an MA option in armchair intelligence, which has produced some of the people in this room, but also, I think, has gone on to produce some of the people who contributed to this book, namely Matt Corder from the Federation of American Scientists and Christian Tribart, who's at the New York Times Visual Investigations Unit. So it's a pleasure to kick off this event, but I'm going to hand you over to Henrietta Wilson, who's a PhD candidate here at King's College London, as well as being a research associate at the school or at SOAS. Sorry, my brain has gone slightly. Anyway, over to you, Henrietta.
Thank you so much, Jack. I'm really pleased to be here. So yes, my name is Henrietta Wilson, and we are here to talk about a new book, Open Source Investigations in the Age of Google. And how we're going to do that is through a panel discussion with some chapter authors. I'm delighted to be joined by Jeffrey Duke, just newly arrived in London, who's the head of secretariat for the South Sudanese Action Network on Small Arms. Alexa Koenig, who you can see on the screen, is from UC Berkeley. She's a research professor there, deputy director of the Human Rights Centre and director of the Human Rights Centre's Investigations Lab. And Kalina Raleigh, who's the CEO of ACLED and a professor of political violence and geography at the UK University of Sussex. So an amazingly eminent, varied set of expertise and experience. And I should say that as well as the panel, we have some chapter authors in the room. Stick your hands up if you contributed to this book. Brilliant. Thank you very much. And why this is significant, I'll introduce you properly. They're going to ask some of the initial questions. The questions are more or less going to be based on common misunderstandings about open source investigations and how our book, how people's work can help to rectify that. But before we get into the panel discussion, I'm going to say a few words about the book. So the first thing to say is I'm the lead editor. I was supported and joined by Dan Plesh. Say hello, Dan. And Ola Samuel. Unfortunately, Ola can't be with us today because he's unwell. And what the book is, it's 18 original chapters focused on open source investigations. And as Jack said, particularly how open source investigations can help strengthen human security. They were written by 32 authors, co-authors, who spanned a whole range of prize-winning practitioners, rising stars, eminent scholars, journalists. So we're really proud of the result. Together, they showcase how different people do open source investigations through different tools and techniques, using different case studies to illustrate the tools and techniques. For example, we have chapters looking at human rights abuses and how open source investigations can find out about those, chapters about global numbers of nuclear weapons, chapters about illicit proliferation of small arms, corruption in the arms trade, political violence, a whole range of different end uses and case studies. We also have examples of different users of open source investigations. For example, we have a chapter about investigative journalism. We have a chapter about the US intelligence community. And it's not all rosy, optimistic, naive analyses. The chapters between them also recognise the real dilemmas and problems facing these new roles. For example, the ethical challenges that practitioners face. And we have one whole chapter about how open source research was misused by QAnon in the run-up to the last presidential election in the USA. So the take-home message from these kind of very quick comments are that this is a very diverse book trying to capture a really rich new field. And just to say, Shazmin Mia over there is from our publisher. She's brought physical copies to sell if anybody's interested. And the ebook is completely free to download. You can see the QR code. I think Shazmin's got the QR code as well. So I do hope that you read it. I hope you get it. I hope you enjoy it and spread the word about it. So that's about the book. And now another few words of orientation. I thought I should say a bit about what we mean by open source investigations. The first thing to say is different people have different words for it. So Jack mentioned open source intelligence. Some people talk about OSINT. Some people talk about open source research. Some people use these terms interchangeably. Some people have quite distinct meanings for them. And in our book, people are very clear about the words they use and why they're using them. For us here, what I want us to focus on is activities, analyses that rely on open sources. In other words, any sort of research activity that's not relying on classified sources, although I'm sure that Rona will have something to say about that later on. And why this is important for us to be thinking about now is that digital technologies have really revolutionized the nature, the amounts, the sorts of open sources people can access. So the internet makes it much easier to get traditional data sources like newspapers. It also provides entirely new data sources like social media posts. Digital tech also means that we have the tools to find, to harvest, to collect, to store, to work across distances, to make use of these data sources. So this is an exciting time and a growing time for this field. All sorts of people are doing it, non-governmental people, non-governmental groups, governments, international organizations, the police, all sorts of people. However, there's also a huge amount of misunderstandings about this field. So that's where we're going to start with our fantastic panel. So I'm going to kick us off with just a broad question to each of you, please, about if you've encountered misunderstandings about the nature of open source research in your work and some ways in which you explain away those misunderstandings, correct them, and something about how your chapter might pick up on some of the common misunderstandings. Shall we go Cleaner and then Jeffrey and then Alexa? Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here again and to work with Henrietta. So ACLAD produces in real time all reported acts of political violence and demonstrations across the world, and we release these data into the wild and do quite a bit of analysis for them and kind of ingest and make some pattern analysis and predictions, etc. And so where we've encountered, let's say, issues with how people have used the data have often been in some ways intentional. There's been this implication that we might be working for a nefarious foreign government, or in some cases, we've encountered two cases in which people were upset about the accuracy of the data rather than any mistakes that we had made. And I'll mention two, which is the first is that the Saudi Arabian government got very upset with us because of how we were discussing attacks that they had launched into northern Yemen. And the rate and pace of those attacks were not widely known. but they were possible to collect as long as you had local Yemeni partners to give you good information and to triangulate that information. Got very upset and they called the US, and the US got very upset with us. And there was a long pattern of people getting upset with us for about 6 months as a result. And then knowing that we wouldn't actually stop producing the information, they gave it up. And now I can't go to Saudi Arabia, but that's neither here nor there, right? The second actually is a discussion about the definitions of conflict or the definitions of rioting, etc. And that came when we produced information that we thought quite positively displayed that the social justice protests in 2020 in the US were overwhelmingly peaceful. About 93% of that activity between the horrible death of George Floyd onwards throughout the year up until the election were peaceful, 93%. And of the 7% that recorded some form of violence, it was often violence done upon the protesters rather than the protesters rioting. In fact, riots were few and far between. Now, this was taken very badly by certain people who are currently running for US president, but it was also bizarrely taken badly by some prominent social justice movements who wanted us to recalibrate that number because their argument that was that violence against infrastructure and buildings and businesses wasn't violence, but violence that was symbolic should be coded, but violence against buildings should not. We got into an interesting discussion about it. We didn't change our minds, in part because one of the benefits of open source, or one of the benefits, is that you can get a wide range of information. But one of the stipulations that I would really emphasize to people is that don't change your definitions by case. If you want to make a very good case about the pattern of conflict, or the pattern of rioting, or the pattern of some sort of particular event, make sure that you invest the time to make sure that it's rigorous and systematic rather than situational and circumstantial. And the reason being is that you're often trying to make a larger point about the nature of conflict in a particular place. And if you change that based on pressure or based on effectively your somewhat biased feelings about a case, you will end up limiting the resonance of your own research rather than extending it.
Thank you so much. What a great starting point. So really interesting and important message about understanding the results and how you generate the results, it being so important to get the questions, the research question and the definitions right and be absolutely explicit about that. Yeah, thank you very much. Jeffrey, could you tell us a bit about any misunderstandings you've encountered? I think it should be on.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I just got to London and still recovering from jet lag. So please bear with me if I'm not so energetic in this. But yeah, one of the main misunderstandings from where I come from, and also the focus of my chapter has been to do with, what the missing piece is in terms of, a large volume of information that could easily constitute open source intelligence exists online. And for many researchers, that suffices, not focusing on what could practically be collected from on the ground to strengthen, some of our investigations. So the new thing that my contribution illustrates is that it's important to appreciate a lot of the information that you cannot find online. But if you work with people like myself and many others who are daily engaging in observation, in practical movements of arms, for example. In our case, small arms or light weapons. There's not so much that you can, there is so much that you could get from observations working with trusted network of people and communities themselves. So that has been, I think, the missing piece, because there's been excessive focus on online data, I think.
Fantastic, Jeffrey. And yes, just to reiterate what you said, we are very lucky to have you here. You only arrived yesterday. Right? So thank you very much for putting up with the travel disruption. So yeah, Jeffrey's chapter is really important in making this case. There's a real limit to how much you can see from remote scrutiny. You need local observers to give culturally specific, language-specific, terrain-specific knowledge to make sense of some of the remote data. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Alexa, your turn, please. Thank you.
Thank you. And congratulations to the editors and all of the authors for this incredible volume. I think one of the biggest things that I've been warned, particularly by our funders, when talking about open source investigations, is somehow demystifying what it takes to do this kind of research. So one of the things one of our funders once told us was, people think this is magic and that only people with very specialized technical skill can do it. And that really kicked off a big conversation among our team of what are the skills that go into digital open source investigation. There is, of course, I think at its foundation, it really is about fundamental research, asking the right questions, designing them so that you can find actual answers to some of the queries that you have in the world, thinking about how to minimize the risk of bias, particularly when we're talking about things like access bias, machine algorithmic bias, human biases that may come into these processes. But then there's that second layer of understanding some of the methodologies that are specific to online environments when we're talking about digital investigation specifically. And that, of course, includes things like knowing how to probe 90% of the internet that we can't get through search engines because that information just hasn't been indexed or graphed by those companies. And then, of course, the third tier, and probably the smallest tier, is learning how to use some of the tools that have been developed that are really helpful for digital open source investigators. I think one of the things that I've really appreciated in working in a university context is we, of course, do teach people fairly frequently how to do this work, both at the student level and at the professional level, and helping people to understand that you don't need advanced tech skills to do this work, and kind of helping to reshape their minds about who can do these kinds of investigations is incredibly important. And just to piggyback on what was just being talked about, I think we're really moving toward understanding these as all source investigations. So thinking about how do we bring people back into these processes? How do we think about testimonial evidence and physical evidence and how that can be triangulated with this digital content so that, one, the quality of the research is as high as it possibly can be, but two, so that we're not forgetting to center the source in open source investigations, as Lemmy McAvoy has recommended. I think I'll leave it at that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alexa. So I really feel this has already got us started on some really important themes for open source investigations generally, and that come through many of the book's chapters. And Alexa's chapter, co-authored with Lindsay Freeman, really speaks about ecosystems of people who are often involved in these big sorts of digital investigations, starting maybe with people on the ground, people that Jeffrey mentioned, or the people that are live tweeting an atrocity, working its way through the data has to work through different people, and to really make that evidentially robust, it's important that everybody's working towards common standards. And just to mention, Alexa was the driving force behind the Berkeley Protocol on digital open source investigations that does exactly that. So thank you, all of you, a great starting point. I'm now going to invite different chapter authors that already revealed themselves to ask some questions about the misunderstandings they come across. And after that, we'll have an opportunity for Q&A with the audience. So if you've got a question or a comment, please do save it. Please do remember it, because we want to hear about it. So for now, I'm going to invite Dan Plesh to get the chapter author questions going, and could you ask a question to Jeffrey Duke, please? Thank you. Well done.
Well, it's been a tremendous journey over the last 4 or so years that you and I, particularly you and I, have had in developing this project, principally at SciAS, and thanks to SciAS for its funding and the space to do its work, and particularly also to the Mark Trust and the Boundary Trust for funding our work on this over the years to put this together. Not perhaps a project we would necessarily typically think about SciAS, but it's part of our project, as you know, on the strategic concept of removal of arms and proliferation, scrap weapons to its friends. And look online at scrapweapons.com, you'll find all sorts of other fun stuff we do from feminism and disarmament through to some extremely technical analysis on missile technology. So that's a little bit of the background. It wasn't on the brief,
but that's good because
have you come across people who assume that your work is satellite dependent, that it's digital, and have you had trouble, trying to convince people actually on the groundwork is at least as important as digital product, and confusions around that issue? Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. It was a pleasure working with you on this, and nice to finally meet. So again, what Dan raised illustrates the challenges in the different conceptions of researchers and practitioners on what constitutes, relevant data in this broader realm of open source investigations. Like I said, there's been a lot of emphasis on, remote sensing, watching things from New York, London, etc. The challenge with one of the challenges with that when it comes to researching on arms movements, especially small arms and light weapons that easily move across the world, and for a country like South Sudan is our weapon of mass destruction, and is not so much that you could do online. You can get information from the UN Register of Small Arms. The International Tracing Instrument mechanisms could help identify information like this bunch of arms have been approved to go to country B or A. Now, official records only goes up to a certain extent. For example, the patches, the end, and the end user government, but it does so little to establish who the practical end users are, because the official records would just show you that it's going to this government. Now, our challenge is that a lot of small arms and light weapons that come officially to governments end up being trafficked to civilians. And some of those weapons are being given by senior military and political officers. And it ends up in the hands of civilians. And some of you who might have been following the South Sudan context can tell that violence perpetuated by civilians using small arms and light weapons constitutes one of the major challenges to peace building and state building in South Sudan. Some of the nature of hostilities that you witness in civilian violence. Actually, some of the scale and damage caused could be, they're actually bigger than the nature of damage that is created in the context of real classic civil war that we have also seen. So what we have seen, is very useful in that context is observing the kind of weapons that are in the hands of the military, and then also looking at the ones in the hands of civilians. And often it's fascinating that you find that these are similar models of weapons. Some of it, if you look at the serial numbers, you can tell that this actually came from this country through official channels to this government and then transferred further to civilians. So one, in a way, we have been able to observe this in the context of several rounds of civilian disarmament, where weapons are collected, often in a violent fashion, but there has been a number of peaceful civilian disarmament campaigns. And whenever these weapons are recovered, you're able to tell apart, but you cannot do this remotely. And once you're able to establish that this weapon came from this country and it's causing havoc in this country, now you have stronger claim-making power to engage governments on the atrocities that have been committed by their weapons. Let me stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. That was a really fantastic insight into this sense, and I think it can be generalized to other case studies that the book represents. A lot of open source research, whatever the particular methodologies or the particular use case you're looking at, it involves meticulous, painstaking tracking of data through different processes, and it also requires things, Alexa sort of mentioned this too, a sense, a bit like the scientific method or critical thinking that we're taught to do in universities, that you can't take things at face value, you look at things, you put them together and you're building a mosaic of evidence. Really fantastic. Kalina or Alexa, would you like to come in with any of those themes?
It was actually very hard for me to hear the question. Sorry,
I turned around
without the microphone.
Sorry, I was just inviting you or Kalina to come in on any of the themes that Jeffrey's raised about the importance of local monitoring and how that often requires really painstaking, careful tracking of really granular data. Yeah. Oh, Kalina's going to comment. Yeah.
Thanks very much. And of course, the work that Jeffrey and the Alliance does is very, very important. It's also very difficult to track weapons. So, so ACLED has tried to take advantage of the information environment, but not depend on it because of the known holes in it. And so what we've done is we have a network of over 85 local partners. We collect information in over 100 languages. Our researchers live in country. And the result is that we have a bit of a global local environment. So we are aggregating information rather than determining what that information is in one place and then sending it down. So it's a lot of exchange between the two. And so we've never used satellite data or anything similar to it, but of course the availability of multiple forms of news sources and reports in whatever that might be. It might be radio in a lot of cases. It might be, as I mentioned before, kind of local stringers. It might be local partners. It might be very small newspapers in a very small community. All of those constitute our main sources. So basically many, 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 many of those. So we have every week a collection corpus of over 5,000 sources in multiple different forms, and then 175 researchers who go over them in great detail. And that's, so it doesn't sound efficient, but it does tell you a systematic accounting of what's happening in the world, using, as I mentioned before, and as Jeffrey mentioned, really clear criteria about what it is you're collecting and how you're collecting it. How you're collecting it is just as important as what you're collecting.
Thank you, Kalina. And Alexa, would you, sorry for this slightly chaotic chairing. Do you want to comment? Yeah, thank you.
No, it's fine. I think we come in at that next link in the chain, which we are often not the primary aggregators of the data. We're often really deeply engaged in the analytical process and in helping the people who have pulled these data sets together understand what they have and what kinds of questions they can answer with the information they've collected, how reliable that information is, et cetera. That, of course, requires doing even more discovery of online information because often we're deep in the weeds around verification. So, we kind of follow, based on the Berkeley Protocol, a three-step process of verifying or re-verifying the data that's been collected, thinking through, is there technical data still attached to this or technical processes that we can use to make sense of what's there? Second, really doing the content analysis, and that's where we would use a lot of the principles that have been designed around careful and methodical assessment of what we can see or hear, for example, in a video. Is the clothing consistent with what we've been told about the time of year and the region in which something has happened? Are the accents what we would anticipate in the community where this is purportedly happening? And then a third, of course, source analysis. So really trying to figure out if we can trace information back to its original sourcing, find the original post if we're talking about social media content, and assess the reliability of that source for that kind of information. That can also, we try to work in predominantly a closed source environment for a lot of that process, in part for security reasons, because we are often working with teams of students on the investigations lab side of the house. So we don't want ultimately people from our team necessarily reaching out and potentially interfering with investigations where they don't understand how that contact could potentially be creating problems downstream. A lot of our work in the investigations lab is done in service of partners. So we work with investigative reporters and other journalists. We're working with legal investigation teams, and then we're working with human rights organizations. So we're often trying to think through what is the appropriate role for that link in the chain, and how do we collaborate and coordinate most effectively. I think one thing that has been particularly helpful among our team is just having a diversity of language skills. So our team, if we have 40 students working on these investigations, they may speak up to a couple dozen, sometimes up to 30 languages. And we often find that for our partners who may be international and not coming from the cultures and the contexts in which the investigation is taking place, even having that linguistic ability is really critical. The final thing I might say is really trying to think about how do we do this in a more efficient manner. We're working on one investigation right now with a coalition of organizations where 2 million data points have been collected from social media content about attacks on women life freedom protesters in Iran. And of course, using some of the more traditional, very manual methodologies, we've gotten through 6,000 of those posts to verify their accuracy. I think that's kind of a jumping off point for really thinking through what humans do well in these processes and where we are going to need machines to complement some of those fundamental skills.
Great, thank you. I mean, you've all given me such a sort of rich viewpoint into the sheer quantities of data that we now have that can be enormously fruitful if you use them in the right way. And Alexa, a very nice mention of potential closed sources, role of closed sources feeds very nicely into our next question from Rona Michi, who's the Director of Projects and Planning at Shadow World Investigations and co-author of chapter 5.3 of our book. Yeah, thank you, Rona. Can somebody get a microphone to Rona, please? Thank you. And I'll invite Kalina to respond first to this one. Yeah, thank you. Oh, nice.
Thank you so much, Henrietta, and thanks to all of you for an incredibly interesting panel. I've been looking forward to this event for a while and the publication of this book. As Henrietta said, I work for an organisation called Shadow World Investigations. We investigate state capture and corruption primarily in the arms trade. And I found in our work, and as has already been hinted at here, there is a misunderstanding that open source research does only solely use open sources. And in fact, our chapter shows that you can have an incredibly effective investigation using both closed and open sources together. We outline some of the ways that you can do this both safely and ethically in our chapter. And how it goes both ways, how you can use open sources. I mean, we particularly are talking about human sources and whistleblowers, but you can use open sources to investigate the right person to kind of lead you in that way towards the closed sources. But then you can also use closed sources of information, use human sources that can be really vital in pointing you in the right direction for your open source investigations. So my question specifically for Kleena and the panel is whether you're aware of any examples of closed and open sources being used together in an open source investigation, and what you think the pros and cons of doing so are. Thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you. So we use quite a number of closed sources in the sense that they're not openly available to everybody. And that's especially the case when we have local partners who do not want to be identified, but who we have verified. And our first priority is that we have put no one in harm. And so if a partner does not want to be public or they don't want to be known, sometimes it's a large institution who doesn't want to be known as providing data consistently, or sometimes it's a small group. We have no problem with that in the sense that, like, we have not promised to be an entirely open source organization. We have promised to be a public data organization. So all of our data are free to download, but it's not always, I think we call it an undisclosed source. That is how we get around it. And it's very vital. I will say that when you have a situation where you have a undisclosed source, you can see that there's a real difference in what they're suggesting is happening within a place and what a more public sources are suggesting happening. So you often don't get these in, you wouldn't get it in India where you're actually overwhelmed with sources, but you might get it for Eritrea, or you might get it for Somalia, right? Where the idea is that this person has unique enough information that it could elicit unwanted attention to them. And so what it's displaying relative to the open source is something different. And we make sure that they're all right with especially the summary, and the summary of those data cannot go back to them. And I think that all the analysis is richer for it, whether it's in the Sahel, where we have a number of undisclosed sources, East Africa, or during the time, especially when the Taliban were coming into Kabul, we had a number of closed sources that were saying just that, even though the news was not saying it. And I think that they are often, like I said, very, very important to understand what's happening that no one's talking about.
Thank you very much, Kleena. I'm going to move us on to the other chapter author questions, but I'm just going to give my own little comment on that as well. So in our chapter on a non-governmental organisation called the Harvard Sussex Programme, that I think Brian will talk a bit more about in a few moments, it's an example of a piece of a group that did open source research before the big use of digital technologies. And on the team, there was someone there with a very high level security clearance. And the team spent a lot of time trying to interact with insiders. And at no point was there any suggestion that people were breaking the Official Secrets Act? But that insider knowledge was enormously helpful in giving little steers about avoid that dead end, or yes, looks like a promising research field. I don't know if you agree with that, Brian. Yeah. So segueing, I'm going to now introduce Professor Brian Balmer, who's a Professor of Science Policy Studies at University College London. Thank you, Brian.
And who started his academic life at the Harvard Sussex programme. Excuse me. My question has been slightly preempted by a lot of the answers. So I was going to ask about what difference the internet has made, but also what besides the internet you use. But I think all three of you have answered that. So forgive me if this hastily written down question. As Henrietta says, our chapter deals with open source in the 1980s and the 1990s, before the internet. And my question is really about whether when you do open source investigations, you feel you're learning from a tradition or a history of other open source investigations, or whether each one's like starting afresh and there's no sort of institutional memory amongst open source researchers.
Thank you, Brian. I think I'll ask Alexa to start off with that question, please. Do you feel that you're drawing on a longer tradition with your digital investigations?
Yes and no. I think this has been one of the fascinating things for me to kind of watch personally. So the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley has been here for 30 years. Our founder, Eric Stover, came from boots on the ground investigations in the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Iraq, etc. And I think when I started building kind of our digital investigations track, there was a little bit of butting heads around, does this have value? I think for him, you know, and I think it's fair to, I think he's spoken about this quite a bit, so it's fair to share, but that the direct relationship to human beings is what really, where he found meaning in these investigations and the check on the quality of the investigation. That said, in starting the investigations lab, one of the first things I tried to do was look at the more recent histories of open source information. And of course it does, you know, there's that great article that just came out recently, looking back 150 years about how people have used more traditional means of communication in these open source investigations, or how governments have used them. One of the histories that I started looking at was Amnesty International, where Eric had worked at one point. And of course, at the time, they had also been tapping into the labor of university students who were combing newspapers all over the world in the languages they might be able to read or speak, clipping those out to identify potential political prisoners and getting that out to their networks to bring attention to some of these wrongs. I see what we're doing today as a direct ancestor or next generation of that, where again, university students are combing now online sources for that information. They have tools like Google Translate when they don't speak the languages. I think what we're looking at is sort of a qualitative and quantitative shift, but really the heart of what is underneath most of this is fairly similar. That said, I do think, you know, whenever we look at how technologies have changed how people communicate, and then what becomes sources for fact-finding about what's happening in the world, it's really a question of how fast that information is traveling and how far it can get in what period of time. There is, of course, though, also the slightly qualitative difference in that with newspapers, radio broadcasts, et cetera, you, of course, have more official journalistic sources that are often aggregating that information and translating it for a broader public. Here, with direct raw footage or raw commentary from people who are at the heart of conflict or crisis, I think there is a qualitative difference that needs to be thought through in terms of how we're doing this work. But I do think our work is most powerful. I'll just kind of land on this. When we do recognize that we are part of a longer, richer history, and that we shouldn't be ignoring that history because our work will be richer for adding this into the body of information that already exists. Radio broadcasts are still so critical for a lot of populations around the world, including here in the United States, including in our current election, which we're right now investigating, that I think we'd be remiss in not helping to share that insight. And thank you for the question.
Thank you, Alexa, for the answer. Really, always fascinating to hear your thoughts about these sorts of things. I'm going to follow it up with my insights. I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot of similarities, and there is a huge shift that's been underpinned by digital tech. I get asked this question in the form of, are open source investigations just research? Like what's making these things different? And there's an article by Joseph Hatfield. There's no such thing as open source intelligence. It's a whole bunch of things that you can call different names. And my answer to that is, yes, it kind of is just research. I do get where that's coming from. It's systematic, careful research, but there is a category that's significantly different now, because lots of people are doing it. Lots of people recognize this category, open source investigations, open source research. So that in itself is making it a different sort of a thing. Yeah, I don't know if anybody agrees or disagrees with that sort of branding. No? Yeah, okay, agree, brilliant, that's easy. So the last chapter author question is going to come from Susanna Guadera, please, who's Research Assistant and Programme Administrator at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and a former very valued colleague here at King's. Yeah, thank you, Susanna.
Thank you so much, Henrietta, and thank you for a great panel. So the misconception that I was tasked with discussing is the one that OSINT-derived intelligence from non-governmental organizations is not necessarily used in support of national and international governance processes. And that is a misconception. There are a lot of NGOs that use OSINT in support of various different processes, governance processes within different areas. And the one that I work in, which is arms control, non-proliferation, export control agreements, treaties. Yes, this work is, I'd say, relatively nascent, and a lot of the time it's not codified in those agreements. So especially when it comes to agreements on strategic weaponry, so usually nuclear weapons, some of the verification will be done by national technical means, so state intelligence capabilities. But more and more NGOs are contributing to implementing those agreements. This is usually done in a more informal, semi-formal, ad hoc way, where, for example, a state party to an agreement will task, fund an NGO with producing specific projects or intelligence in support of a specific mission. But also, for example, when you think about, for example, the additional protocol to the International Atomic Energy Agency nuclear safeguards, that sort of codifies OSINT in that work because it places emphasis on incorporating all different sources of information. And that, in turn led to the establishment of a relevant division within the IAEA that now uses OSINT in their everyday work. And and so in our chapter, we discuss some of the workflow that goes into specifically using OSINT in NGOs in support of some non-proliferation agreements and various sanctions regimes, etc. And we also provide two different options for scaling up and institutionalizing this effort. And so my question to the panelists is, what role do you see for NGOs, broadly speaking, supporting international and national governance processes? What benefits do you see from that? What challenges? And what can be done to, scale it up and institutionalize it?
Great, thank you, Susanna. I'm going to invite Jeffrey to reflect on that first, because you track small arms and ultimately are hoping to feed into national, international policy making. So how do you think open source investigations by non-governmental groups can be used in global governance, national governance systems? Thank you.
Thanks for that question. Again, I will look at this from the angle of small arms control. That is where my work revolves. Now, I would like to highlight one political dimension to open source intelligence. So while we're, collecting all sorts of information about illicit flows of weapons, etc., and these do have implications such as practical decisions that have to be made by governments at either bilaterally or within, for example, the UN system. One major contribution that the NGOs have done recently that I would like to highlight to illustrate how globally this could be perhaps scaled up is information that backed up a major decision in a country like South Sudan. And that was an imposition of arms embargo. While, you know, the South Sudan crisis was very active and at a higher scale, NGOs collected evidence to illustrate that arms are practically causing harm in this country. And here is all sorts of evidence that you might need to make a political decision to impose arms embargo on South Sudan. I have been practically involved in that process, and it's a scary process because the evidence that you provide has a very huge implication on the bilateral politics and I mean global politics and also bilateral relations between and among states. Now, so this means that while the information that we collect could help positively, there's also risks of weaponization of our findings. You know, someone could use this information for their negative, relations with other countries. But before I conclude, I would like to highlight the dangers that comes with that at the level of, the NGOs and actors. Useful information are coming out, but when it comes out that you are the ones who generated this information, you have a problem with your government. See? So we're treading very thin line between supportive, research and putting our lives at risk. However, if we build a global network of actors who can, safely exchange this information, but also most importantly, make sense of the political dimension in different contexts, and then we can make open source research a positive thing that contributes to enhancing global security and governance processes, including anti-corruption efforts in the sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. A really interesting insight into the potential for amplifying your results if you can work in solidarity with other practitioners to get the results into the right places. Thank you. I'd like to invite Alexa to think about this, because the Berkeley Protocol is, it seems to me, a way of doing what Susanna suggested, but in the human rights legal space. So is that how you see the Berkeley Protocol, as a way of harnessing coordinating global efforts in order to maximize their uptake? And if so, have you got any lessons for other governance systems, in particular weapons of mass destruction? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I think the whole impetus behind the Berkeley Protocol was recognizing that there was a wave of social media content in particular that was about to become relevant to cases at the International Criminal Court. So I started working with this content in 2011 when we were looking at how the ICC, how its cases were progressing. And we did a big research study, and the answer, unfortunately, was not great. A number of cases had kind of fallen apart at early stages of prosecution. And the answer as to why was really twofold. One, the judges were saying of the prosecution, You're over-relying on the stories of survivors without bringing in the corroborating information needed to meet the evidentiary standards to allow these cases to proceed. The second piece that the judges were saying was that the prosecution was over-relying on what they were calling open source information, and that wasn't primary evidence and couldn't become and would never be primary evidence for courts. Now, it took me years to understand. I felt really stupid in the beginning of why wouldn't a video posted to social media that showed something awful happening potentially be relevant and or probative in relation to an international criminal case. Now, what I now understand is that they were pointing to the use of things like UN reports or Amnesty International reports, things that were aggregations of primary data, but in themselves were secondary data and were impossible to probe for the reliability of the underlying information. So I do think that's why later on we saw things like the Rafali case come out of Libya, where a leader of the Al-Saika Brigade was accused of the extrajudicial killing of, I think, over 30 people. And one of the two primary sources for the warrant of arrest that was later issued by the court was one, a UN report, and then a number of videos that have been posted to Facebook. So I think that was very telling in the evolution of the uses of this kind of content in the international criminal justice space. What we were worried about was really twofold. One, were courts going to be ready for this kind of information to come in? Would they be able to use it in a way that was impactful? But two, when it got in front of judges, was there a risk that judges would either find this information so convincing that it was overweighted in terms of its value, or two, that they wouldn't understand would be confused about how to probe its reliability and authenticity, and therefore all this work of these open source investigators would sort of be for naught. So long story short, I think the Berkeley Protocol became an opportunity to try and come up with, if you're going to do this work, here's the kinds of things we're hoping you'll think about. And it really was an international effort. More than 150 people who work in different aspects of investigations for different end uses were interviewed about what they see as some of the kind of minimum standards that needed to be put in place. Definitions and even having common terminology, I think, became really important for this area of practice. We found that people were calling things evidence because they were journalists. You know, they were saying that a particular post was evidence of something happening. The lawyers were going apoplectic because they're like, this isn't evidence that can ever be entered into a court of law. So, you know, the first day of kind of deliberations around whether a protocol was even needed, I had assigned 2 hours to just come up with 4 definitions, and it took 8 hours to come up with those definitions. I think that in itself was very telling about the state of the broader field of practice, particularly when you're trying to work across communities of practice. And you have journalists working alongside computer scientists, alongside lawyers, et cetera, all hoping something in our social environment is going to change, and that governments will be inspired and compelled to put pressure internally or externally on other governments to change some form of behavior. And I do think that becomes sort of the nexus. We have certainly seen the impact of that. I do think that it becomes at civil society, these NGOs become in many ways a watchdog and a check on what governments are putting out. When governments had sole domain over satellite imagery, when they had access to resources that the public didn't have, there was a lot more ability, I would argue, to kind of control the narratives that were coming back with less pushback. I do think this is really interesting for democratic processes to now have civil society and NGOs saying, hey, we're doing parallel investigations, and either what we're finding is in tension with what you're putting out into the world, and therefore we need to see whether you challenge whether you really are in compliance with some of these governance structures, or whether it's consistent and something's working in this international framework.
Fantastic, Alexa. Thank you very much. So what I heard there is the importance of process in getting the right information in the first place, often across quite different sets of people who might not even have the same definitions for things, and also perhaps about educating the end process, educating the International Criminal Court about the significance of this new set of digital investigatory techniques. Kleena, does ACLED think about how their findings might be used in governance, legal contexts? Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, you know, one of our main, or in fact, our main conduit of support are governments, very varied governments, and who integrate the data consistently into their, you know, prediction mechanisms or their monitoring or evaluation or any number of ways in which they're trying to determine what their next steps are, where their development needs are going to be the highest. So it really depends, I think, on whether or not the data are amenable to different lenses, right? So at any given government, they will have, in some respects, a military lens. They want to know literally how many kilometers have been taken by a group or not, or how many active armed organizations there are operating in a space. There's also, of course, components of even this government in this country who are looking at it through a human rights or a humanitarian framing, which is, what are the costs of this conflict in terms of people exposed, people leaving, food security, you know, destroyed schools, all the rest of it. And so you have to be able to speak to both of those, I think, if you want to be comprehensively used. There's also people who are going to look at it from a political angle. So what kind of geopolitical risks are apparent if this group manages to compete with another group, or to overtake a particular, you know, urban area or the capital or whatever. And those political considerations about how different political entities will be aligned afterwards aren't something that you can get directly from the data, but there are things that, you know, somebody who's got an excellent contextual understanding of a case can use open source or quantitative information to set the scene for what's likely to come. Governments need all of those things. And if we can assist, again, reliably, robustly, systematically with how that information is public, so it's not restricted to one government, but to all, I think that, that we put people on a better playing field to be able to react well.
Thank you, all of the panelists. You've given such really rich and different answers to that question, which I think, again, emphasises this idea that open source investigations spans a whole bunch of different monitoring, different scrutiny, different use cases. But underlying it all are similar principles about setting your research questions, doing due diligence in how the process works. So thank you. I'm now going to invite questions from the audience. Great, thank you very much. If you could say your name and where you're from, please. And if you do want to direct your question to a particular panelist, please say that as well. Otherwise, I'll allocate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, for a really stimulating discussion so far. My name's Gavin Barlow. I'm an ex-civil servant, now postgrad here at King's. I'm not an intelligence expert, but I have done some work in this area in the centre of government. And I wanted to challenge you, Henrietta, on your initial definitions, since we've been doing a bit of definitions. And I have to say, I found it a bit circular that when we're talking about open source investigations, we're talking about activities or analysis that involve open sources, because I think there's actually quite a grey area between secret intelligence and open source. And I also think that the boundaries between the things, to the extent that there are boundaries, are constantly shifting. So, for example, the sorts of satellite intelligence that people can see and buy or is just freely distributed now today would have been regarded as intensely secret just a few decades ago. And I think there are, I've come across a number of open source organizations who use methods that would be illegal if they were practiced by government agencies. And certainly there are grey areas where both will use the dark web, will procure ad tech, will accumulate personal data, will use what I think have been referred to here as closed sources, which sound a lot like secret agents to me. And I just wondered if you could comment on whether you'd agree that there is a grey area between secret intelligence and open source intelligence, and on whether you think that actually that matters, and whether we need to understand it a bit better, or maybe be clear about our definitions. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a great question, and is going to enable me to clarify some things that come with the book. and that Rona sort of indicated in her question about the use of closed sources in open source investigations. And Brian and I talked a bit about our background in the Harvard Sussex programme doing exactly this. So I agree with you. I don't think there's a clear binary between open and closed. And in our chapter on the Harvard Sussex programme, we think about 4 different categories, actually. We think about open available sources. Those are the sorts of things you might find in the newspaper. I mean, of course, that's not even straightforwardly open, because sometimes you need to pay a subscription and some people might not have the same money. In different countries, you might have different entitlement. If you're using a different search engine, it might not be as open to you. But we have open available, open restricted, which is maybe what you might think of as being what traditionally academics might call grey literature. So something that you might have to go in somewhere to find in an archive. We also talk about open request sources, which is you ask the right person the right question. So just because you've got a Freedom of Information Act, it doesn't mean that all the information can be got easily. But if you ask the right question, you might get the right answer. But you kind of have to have known what the right language is. So often having some sort of steer from a closed source can be very helpful. And then the closed restricted category is, as you say, sort of completely classified sources. But we know, right, that sometimes classified sources are declassified, and sometimes declassified sources are reclassified. So this isn't a stable categorization at all. And I think we heard from the panelists about sometimes closed sources are really important for helping you know that you're on the right lines, for pointing you in the right direction, for showing you something that you hadn't seen. For example, if there were an open source where the critical information were buried in footnote 8, that you don't know the right language, having somebody with a bit of background in the closed sources can help clarify that sort of thing. So I don't know if what I've said chimes with your initial comments, or it feels like we're sort of on the same page, but I don't know if you feel that. Oh, sorry, yeah.
In government, I don't want to hog the mic. In government circles, if you start saying, "Oh, I want more money for open source" or something like that, then you quite quickly run into problems, I think, with people asking you, "Well, what is that exactly, and why is it different from what GCHQ can do, or whoever it is?" And I think on the other side, from using external organisations, I think we often look at what they're doing and think, "Well, do they really understand the moral and legal issues that they're getting into, and do we understand ourselves how well they're handling those things?" And often when people like yourselves talk about open sources, I have to say I find I think you have a much deeper understanding of what you're doing and the way in which you're controlling the frameworks for which you're doing. But I don't think it's the same in each organisation. You know, I don't think there's a common language across the community which makes it easy to navigate. Anyway, that was all I wanted to say on that.
So I think you've picked up on some really important points. Common language, we've heard different use cases. I mean, well, different case studies. People on our panel are tracking different things. People in the other chapter authors are tracking different things. And yes, they're doing slightly different jobs. Nevertheless, there is conceptually this new category of open source research, which I think is making a difference in the public consciousness and in policy making circles and in funding circles. I don't know, do you want to come in on that? Yeah, here you go.
Thank you. So what I would say is that, when I do my own research across African states, I'll often find that where there would have been maybe a robust intelligence presence, there no longer is, right? And so there often isn't the knowledge, even back in the particular countries that would be interested about the occurrences, about what's happening. And so they're depending in part on systematically unbiased collected information in order to get some part of the way that they would have, sent back narratives before, right? What I do think is unique is what I think you mentioned at the end there, which is that putting something together versus looking at a spreadsheet of data is a very different process, right? Because if you don't know anything about the armed groups in Myanmar, you're going to probably make some very superficial statements about what it is they're up to and what might be the next stage or what the trajectory is or whatever the case. Those who didn't necessarily collect the data but have a lot of contextual knowledge because it's their job to do so are able to probably make sense of these raw parts of data in a much more meaningful way that we may never hear about. So the pattern itself is important, the significance is important rather than the raw data itself, which they don't necessarily need to collect, but they want to know is at least representative of what's happening.
Thank you, Kalina. Alexa, would you like to say anything? Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Alexa.
That'd be great. You know, I find this such a fascinating topic because I do think the digital open source investigations community is using a lot of the same methodologies as law enforcement, intelligence gathering, surveillance, et cetera. And for a while at the, you know, in the early 2010s, when I think this was really starting to evolve into a thing, at least in the IHRL space, the humanitarian law, human rights law, criminal law space, there was sort of an ethos of, well, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, it's okay that we're doing this. And, you know, obviously that's not an adequate check. You know, I do think it's fascinating how law enforcement, who does the same things as civil society, has, you know, and rightfully so, because of our concerns with government overreach, has limitations that civil society doesn't have. So, for example, going to a Facebook page more than 3 times might be considered unwarranted surveillance that could put your investigation in jeopardy. Everyday people who may be doing this as citizen journalists don't necessarily have that same constraint. But I do think there needs to be a lot more attention paid to kind of when you're setting up an investigation, who are you and to what end are you doing this work, to really think about what I would say are 3 really important things to have thought through. First, legally, what can I, for this end purpose, given my status, actually legally do? Second, if I'm able to do this legally, what does my professional code of ethics say I can or can't do? And this is where I've seen a huge difference between the investigative reporters that I work with and the legal analysts that I'm working with. And then third, when that fails to provide clear guidance, sort of what is an emerging sense of open source investigative ethics that should be applied to our decision-making around what's right and wrong. And in talking with journalists and lawyers and human rights practitioners all over the world, there's kind of 3 things that they seem to land on. One, the security consideration. So who's at risk if I do this work? You know, thinking about myself, my team, but also, of course, the people that I'm purporting to serve and amplify, et cetera. 2, how is this going to affect the accuracy of my understanding of this particular conflict? And then 3, the dignity of the people that are involved. And I think those have kind of become the touchstone for thinking through when we do something and when we don't, with the understanding that, of course, you know, we really can't bring this down to a binary of we're doing this for good reasons. That's never going to be sufficient.
I love that answer, Alexa. Thank you. This sense of it's not always, I mean, is it ever easy to know that you're a complete force for good in these areas? You know, you try your hardest and you do your due diligence and you check all these things. But you gave a sense about sometimes different people might arrive at different answers, which I think is very important to remember. Jeffrey, did you want to come in on this discussion at all?
Perhaps just one additional stuff. While we're doing, you know, the kind of work we're doing on ground, one major risk is associated with how far can we go in unearthing information, and you know, how transparent can we be about making this information available, because of all sorts of different ways in which actors may use this information. So yeah, I will also emphasize that we really have to look at our research from you know, a clear political analysis, taking case by case, because now it's becoming a concern that sometimes what we are doing is essentially what classical intelligence agencies are doing. using different tools and approaches. Now, one problem is, especially if we get money or rather funding for such investigations from governments, we have to be very careful the interest of these governments in especially supporting NGOs and researchers to go and collect those kind of information, because in the end, you might find yourself unknowingly just doing intelligence work for that person. So we have to be really careful with the kind of resources associated to engaging in all sorts of investigation. And sometimes you find that when you actually make information only available for the donor of that project, it's useful, but to an extent, it looks like you're doing mercenary work for that government. For example, one project I would like to highlight is Actors and Alliance mapping in South Sudan, where you see profiles of over 200 top military and political actors. And you go to the website and say who is who. You have this is so-and-so. He has been a rebel from this side, but then he moved to the other side. He established alliances with these people. He's having really good relations with these governments. His friends within the region are so-and-so politically, so-and-so militarily. So this information can be used for good, but also against that actor. So there has to, what measures the researchers have taken is to have two layers. One is for everyone, but there is the second layer where you have to use a password, and to have access to that password, you need to personally contact the researchers to enroll you and issue you username and password. So these are some of the risks and dilemmas that we should really be aware about, so that in the end, our findings can make a positive change instead of being used for political motives. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I think Professor Dan Plesh wants to come in now. But, yeah,
if I might, just to follow up immediately, Jeffrey, I think there are very, very few people in this room who do this work and suffer or risk in reality direct physical harm. And I think you give a very calm and precise analysis of the issues which maybe academically we all face, but in the environment where you have worked, it's all too real. And I think we should all, take a second to recognize that. But building upon your remarks and on the question, I think we all exist in this world is very confused. At one level, we are all here based upon good faith efforts, but in the development of the question, I think, and your response, I think doesn't behoove those of us who work in the privileged West to, if not bite, to nibble the hand that feeds us. That if we are not critical and seen to be critical of those people who are paying our rent and providing our environment, then are we not then simply a broad arm of the wider culture or state that we're operating in? And I think that's a vital a benchmark that we all need to bear in mind. Two further points, if I might stretch your tolerance, Madam Chair. The first is out of the confusion. We shouldn't for 1 second believe that, well, I guess I'm more slow horses than anything else here. But just as a minor anecdote, in the last 6 months, I've been invited at least 3 times to government meetings. And on each occasion, entirely separate departments, and to avoid embarrassing the guilty, I won't say what they are. On each occasion, there's been an invitation list of perhaps 200 people. And the government official sending me that email has used the CC function and not the BCC function, which means that at that level, they are, that is a direct illegal contravention of GDPR, a spreading of large numbers of contacts randomly to people. And it happened once and I blinked, but it's happened 3 times. And I think if that level of elementary incompetence exists in government on a systemic basis, I'm terrified what the reality is, but it also puts further responsibility on those of us in civil society. And if I may go back to the point about nibbling the hands that feed us, it isn't so much classified, unclassified. I've never wittingly looked at any classified information in my life, nor do I wish to. But people do object if you put open source information together and find that 2 and 2 makes 4, or occasionally even 22, depending on how you put the numbers together. And it's that analytical function on our governments that I think has been key to the development of democratic society over the years. And there are many very good examples of that. And I think that needs to be underpinned for a variety of reasons, not least because we shouldn't assume that those people running the show are in fact running the show. Thank you, Henrietta.
Thank you. Good points. Well made. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any other questions? Yes. So great. Thank you, James. And I should also ask James.
Sorry, yeah. Thank you. I have a question here. Also, I would like to ask anybody who's joining us online if they have a question. They're very welcome to place it in the chat and we can ask it on their behalf. So yeah, please go ahead.
Alison Killing, Financial Times. I wanted to ask about the tension between open source investigations and privacy and surveillance. A lot of the tools that we rely on can do double duty as surveillance tools, and so put at risk many of the people who I think us in this room are sympathetic to, the journalists and activists and civil society actors. With that in mind, I wanted to ask what you see as sort of like an ideal level of privacy in those platforms, in like Facebook and Twitter and Telegram, knowing that on the one hand, it's going to help, an elevated level of privacy would help to keep people safe, and, you know, make civil society make a lot of things in democracy possible. And on the other hand, it's going to make our job as open source investigators much more difficult.
Thank you, Alison, for that question, and also for your amazing open source investigations into China. Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to invite Alexa to comment on that first, the boundary between privacy, surveillance, open source investigations, and what an ideal level of privacy should be on social media platforms. Thank you, Alexa.
Thank you. And I just want to echo the comment, Alison, about your work and how much we all appreciate some of the methodological advances you've helped make in the space. I think, you know, I might just start with a quick story. Back in, I think it was 2017, because information uploaded to the social media platforms had been, you know, videos, photographs had been downloaded, the metadata had been pulled off. It allowed people to stalk other human beings with a great degree of precision by being able to track their movements, where they'd been, where they potentially were, if they were, you know, putting up tweets in real time or Facebook posts in real time. There was, you know, kind of this movement across major social media platforms, at least, to scrape all the metadata. And I remember among the digital open source investigations community, this kind of collective, oh no, what are we going to do now? And it's been this, I think for the last decade, it's been this push-pull between the considerations of privacy and the ability to get information about who, where, what, when, and how something actually took place. Certainly our ability to search Facebook and some of the tools that had been put together to allow us to just get someone's ID and find all this intimate information, it almost feels like a little bit of an arms race that's been happening in the space. That said, even though there was this, oh my goodness, what are we going to do now moment, it was like in the next breath that you realize, oh, I don't want people getting stalked and killed because they're posting a picture of their dinner to Facebook and someone who's out to get them through domestic violence or whatever is using this to track them. So I think for us as human rights practitioners, it's really been how do we make sure that the North Star we're working toward is the people that we're trying to help, the people who've been most impacted by conflict or crisis, and that their needs are first, and that sometimes the tools we have for investigation are not the tools they need to be safe, to be secure, or to get what they want longer term in terms of some form of reparation or accountability. So I do think it also has forced us as a community of practice to be a lot more thoughtful in terms of how we operate. Certainly, we've seen this transition, and I think it's been such an important one, from collaborative work happening on Twitter in real time, where someone puts up a picture and then a community of practice is trying to geolocate that image, figure out where something happened, get additional details about it. But unfortunately, you're not able to vet that information in ways that, you know, we've all seen perpetrators be named who ended up not being the perpetrators, and they ended up being families that were doxxed or endangered or had threats against their life put up against them. So this movement towards communication in closed spaces and private spaces, I think, has been really an important development among the norms of how we work as digital open source investigators, at least. I do think we need a lot more conversations around this. Privacy is one of the human rights. That is a human rights person I am bound to uphold, at the same time that access to information, freedom of expression, national security are potentially equivalent interests, and triangulating those and really thinking through how we communicate and collaborate is a big piece. The last thing I might say is I do think the mosaic effect is real, and I do think we need to be really thoughtful about these little grains of information that we're putting back out into the world and how they can be used. I remember going through one training and we were given redacted declassified documents, but the redactions were there. And within 5 minutes, I could get the identity of a CIA agent whose name had been kept anonymous, because I just found little threads of information around that and went online and had her ID and where she was within a very short period of time. So I think that's something that we also kind of, at least some of us, have kind of tried to turn a blind eye to, that it's really difficult these days to figure out what we can put back out into the world without endangering people, and either inadvertently or deliberately.
Thank you, Alexa. Okay, brilliant. I would like, if this is an unusual step, but Alison, could you answer your own question and reflect on how you think about these things?
I'm regretting asking that now.
So your investigations typically are remote investigations where you don't have that person-to-person contact so much. So does it matter that thinking about their privacy in the sorts of work that you've done? Because what you've done is you've uncovered unambiguous violations of human rights. So does the privacy surveillance boundary occur to you when you're doing your work?
I mean, yeah, it does. I mean, we're bound by a very strict editorial code. We're also, every time we want to do something, we're also having to go through a lot of like very strict ethical and legal reviews. Like, does this comply with GDPR, for example, is one that we're constantly faced with, and how, and you know, what are the ways that you're mitigating those risks? So it is something that we're constantly thinking about. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, there was a recent project that we did. I mean, I think one thing that is kind of interesting is that as one door shuts in terms of being able to investigate, others are starting to open as well, and posing new privacy risks if they're not handled well enough. I mean, we recently did a project where we were looking for a series of missing, like, Ukrainian children, and we found a website with photographs of children who had been abducted, and at the same time we found this website with a list of all of the children who were available for adoption in Russia, and we downloaded those two databases and we used facial recognition tools to compare them, and we found a load of matches. And then I had to work very closely with the Ukrainian authorities to try and confirm those matches in a way that safeguarded the children's well-being. Yeah, and I'm sorry, this is right at the end of the day, and I'm like,
no, I'm sorry to put you on the spot. That's already given us a really good insight into this sort of, yes, there's things that you need to check, and yes, sometimes there's not a rule that you can follow. You find the data and then you do it on a case-by-case basis. Is that reading too much into what you just said?
I think that's fair. I mean, it extends the process like hugely, but sort of taking that time to think through, like, what are the ethical dimensions of this? How do we store the data in a way that is secure? How do we progress this investigation in a way that safeguards those children, safeguards their identity, and increases the chances that the Ukrainian authorities and their parents can get them back? Were all things that we were constantly having to think about throughout that. Yeah.
Thank you. Really fantastic. We've got a couple of questions here, and we are getting close. Oh, we've got 3 questions. So there's one at the front, James, Dan Liu, and another one at the front. We'll hear all of your questions at once because we're getting to be at the end of time, and then I'll invite all the panelists to respond to all the questions and give some final comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Tarek York. I'm a civil servant. I work with the Cabinet Office. Following on from, I think, everybody's questions that have led to this point, is there a sense that some of the open source material that you're analysing, data information, once you've analysed it, if you then release it, could result in that data source being closed off? I would classify closed sources of information as being information and data that is being protected, defended, controlled in some way. And that, is this something that you have to take into consideration? And how do you actually balance that benefit of publication for probative value, for evidential value, for getting people on side, against the risk that once that information is out and they know how you've done this, what you've done, what your sources and methods were, that they could close that off, or worse, start feeding misinformation, disinformation?
Thank you. Great question. And if you hand the microphone to Dan, please. Oh, okay. Okay, great. Streamlined questions. That's brilliant. And finally, yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Finn. I'm an MA student here at King's. I know it's an overused buzzword, but I wanted to ask how you feel AI has impacted the ability to perform OSINT, maybe not just in some of the obvious positive ways, but also potentially some negative ways, not just currently, but maybe also going forward?
Thank you. Another great question. So I'm going to go in the order of Cleaner, Jeffrey, and Alexa to respond to either of those questions or give us some final comments. Is there a risk about publishing your work that you'll close things off, or the impact of AI? Thank you, Cleaner.
Thank you very much. The data are always public and they stay public, but I'm not always in control. In fact, I'm not at all about what people do once they have those data, that's for sure. We have a lot of guidelines, which I will say that the academic community was the one who pushed back the most on that. The very idea that they would be at terms and conditions towards their use. But no one else did. Although maybe they just didn't because they didn't want to tell me they were going to push back on it. But, and of course, we have an ethics committee where we consider about the use before we engage with people as potential partners or clients. Yeah, I mean, it's a struggle for sure. We don't want people to be harmed, and we also don't want bad information being generated from carefully curated information that we've put together. So yeah, it's a concern. With AI, honestly, I feel like the situation is changing so constantly that I can't give a particularly good answer, only to say that with automated data collection, I can say that it's largely nonsense. So the noise gets lost. Well, the signal gets totally lost in the noise of it. And I can't imagine AI is going to be any better, if not totally worse than that. People are a very important part of the collecting information about what we're doing. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Jeffrey.
Oh, sorry, Jeffrey.
Thanks. There is a risk definitely of using findings for causing harm, especially to some of us who are on the ground on a daily basis, engaging in these spaces. Now, of course, there is a benefit of disclosing your sources so that you can strengthen your analysis. That transparency does need to be balanced with the realities of risks that our contacts and networks operate in. And it's not easy to draw that balance, because however carefully you want to present your findings, sometimes someone could easily find your anonymous source, because in certain spaces on the ground, there are not so many people engaging on that subject. For example, small arms control in South Sudan, if you find 3 organizations working on it, you're lucky. So information coming about arms tracking and the rest could easily, be traced back to Jeffrey and the organization works for. So if any of you do not wish to cause harm to me, definitely how you use the information that I give you about arms transfers and trafficking, etc. You can easily trace that kind of information to me. This is just one example. In different contexts, you find a handful of what others may call gatekeepers to local communities. So you find 10 researchers from London going to that same community, end up speaking to the same people, because of their work, it places them as informed and experienced people on a range of issues at the community level. So ultimately, their safety and security might also be kept by one and messed up by another researcher, because you're talking about the same people on similar issues in the sector. So not an easy work, but definitely careful balance between transparency, the fashion in which we share our findings, and the safety and security of the local communities and the actors. Definitely needs to be balanced. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. And again, as echoing what Dan Plesh said a moment ago, thank you for giving us that very real insight into the people on the ground that are doing this sort of work, face very different sorts of levels of risks to maybe the remote monitors. Thank you. Last word to Alexa, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for those questions. The first, we had a very real case study of this phenomenon of what to release and what not to just this past 2 weeks. So we are part of an Iran Digital Archive Coalition that will be launching a series of reports about what's happening on the ground in Iran, mostly through outside sources, but some through internal sources. And one of the things that we really had to debate in the first report coming out last week was, who do we name of the 124 different people that we have identified as experience having been blinded in the context of the Women Life Freedom protests in Iran, who have all been posting to social media, who there's public information about? Do we name them or do we not? And it ended up being 7 organizations coming together to discuss who gets named and who doesn't. And it was everything from assessments of how public they seem to want to be with their constant pushing of information out. Are they children? Are they adults? Are they in many of these instances, there were not people that we could safely contact without putting them at greater risk. Talking to some of the journalists who were in direct contact with them about what some of the risks may be, et cetera. And I still am not sure we got it right, but we did keep the majority of them anonymous. I think one of the questions that comes up for me is who needs to know? Who needs to know the methods we've used? Who needs to know the identities of these people? And ultimately, what we will do is share that with the UN's fact-finding mission on Iran, but may not make that information public. And I think increasingly, we're having to ask ourselves, is our work ego-driven or is it impact-driven? From an ego perspective, it'd be great to show off what we're capable of doing, but a lot of times we make the decision not to because we care greater about the longer term impact of the work and who actually needs access to that kinds of methodological information or data. China is another big circumstance where we've done research where I think even within the open source community, there's a reluctance to share insights, more so than with most countries where we're looking at different conflicts or crises. And that's because there is such a real risk that those channels of information, the few that still exist, will be shut down in addition to the risks to people on the ground. Same thing with Iran. We're seeing a lot of people's Instagrams, et cetera, being shut down, either because of government complaints or because they've chosen to self-censor because of the dangers that they're seeing from putting this information out to the world. On the last piece on how AI has affected this, I would just echo that I think we do have to be, anyone who studies data science knows that it's that garbage in, garbage out. We know that there's these deep biases embedded in the data sets on which many of these AI models are being trained. So that does give me pause for certain kinds of practices. The next big workshop I'd like to see is really a coming together of digital open source investigators to talk about what are appropriate uses of AI, what are potentially dangerous uses of AI in our space. The last thing I'll say is certainly with having these data sets of say 2 million, 3 million pieces of content, that is not human scale. We're gonna need AI and machine learning based tools to do rough cuts. So if we're doing blinding of protesters, can we use a machine learning based tool to at least identify the videos and photographs where there's blood on someone's face? That's gonna be imperfect and we accept that, but it'll at least help us get down and complement what humans can do. I do think AI could be extraordinarily valuable for things that are particularly hard to investigate and prosecute right now. And an example I would give is sexual and gender-based violence. It's one of the most under-prosecuted sets of crimes because it's very hard to establish. But we know from war crimes investigations that there are proxy indicators that suggest sexual and gender-based violence may be happening in a particular incident. And this is where I do think statistical modeling and probabilistic modeling can be potentially helpful to help search for those proxy indicators and potentially flag on-the-ground investigators or other investigators. This is a context in which you need to look closer because it's very possible that evidence of these crimes exist. And we're going to have to do a lot more on natural language processing, I think, to make that happen. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. You know, it's all of these wonderful comments want me to ask more questions, but it is time to close this down. So this has been an absolutely fantastic discussion. I've really got a sense from all our speakers, our chapter author asking questions, that open source investigations can and do make a difference. They often involve a lot of people, a lot of data, but they're not always good and they're not always easy. And while there are processes that can help lead to right thinking answers and useful research, the processes need to be followed carefully. People need to check themselves. There are guidelines that can make things better, but you can't be complacent about those. They need to be followed carefully. I think also some of the take homes that I've had, really interesting conversation about open versus closed and the reality of the ethical challenges that are faced all the way through everybody's investigations. Also, a final kind of take home message for me is this sense about open source investigations don't need to silo different things. If they're done by non-governmental groups, picking up on something Alexa said a while ago, sometimes non-governmental groups can do things better than other parts of civil society. And the sense about joining up some of these efforts to maximize their accuracy and maximize their impact. So thank you, everybody, for being here. I would like to thank very much our panelists. Could we give a clap to them, please? And the other chapter authors asked fantastic questions. Thank you very much. Well, thank you. Much more important than that, the amazing King's team that have made all of this happen. I can't say how absolutely brilliant they've been. James Brady, Marcia Clough, I don't know if she's here, Elora, Nyasi, Matthew Ferguson, and I don't think Lauren Midgley or Paula Munoz are here. And the AV team, absolutely fantastic. So can we give a big clap to them? Thank you. And to our wonderful audience, it's really great to see so many of you on such a miserable day. Thanks to the online people for coming. I'm afraid I can't invite you to stay, the online people, but to everybody that's in the room, please stay a bit, please chat, please ask more questions, and do help yourself to some catering. And download the book, have a look at the book, because as rich as this has been, there's much more content in the book. Thank you all very much. Brilliant. Yeah.